Perfect. Um, so you're probably going to see this in every presentation that you jump in. Um, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with CYAN, but just in case you aren't, again, we are a statewide technical assistance agency with 3 primary programs. We have our youth program, which really focuses on engaging youth to impact policy change within their local communities. Our college program, which is mostly what we're going to be talking about today, which really supports campuses in adopting, implementing, and enforcing tobacco-free policies, and then also, of course, encouraging and supporting quit attempts. And then finally, our military project, which works to change the norm of tobacco use in military installations. And then we've just got a little blurb there about our technical assistance offerings. And we do also want to point out that we are fully funded by the California Tobacco Control Program. So just a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to start off by talking about really how to craft your social media messaging. And we're going to be using a case study of 2 full campaigns that we created and deployed in the last 10 months, and how to start that process. Next, we're going to share kind of an overview of how we did our consumer testing, both with the messages and the images. And that was tested with youth and young adults throughout California. And just really looking at sort of what that whole process looked like from start to finish. And again, looking at what that SurveyMonkey feedback looked like, how we incorporated that feedback, and then how we placed and promoted those campaign posts. And then we're going to talk kind of about our lessons learned. So this is going to be the storytelling and the case study portion of the presentation. And really the key takeaways and the best practices that we learned when crafting these messages for youth and young adults on social media. And then finally, we're going to share the social media resources that CYAN has available for you to use and leverage. And then again, time permitting, hopefully we will be able to have a bit of a discussion and some questions at the end. So I'm sure it's no surprise with our changing landscape right now in a pandemic that social media is a huge tool for us right now. We know that youth and young adults are continuing to engage with social media. And so we really want to use social media and place resources that will motivate and encourage quit attempts where we know youth and young adults are going to see them. And it's kind of like that old saying of like, you know, you've got to meet folks where they're at. And young folks are interfacing on social media at increased rates. And so that's where we need to be sharing and promoting and placing prevention and cessation messages. That doesn't mean that there's still not space for pamphlets or brochures or other types of print media. But with most young people and students, you know, remotely attending school, they're not going to have access to health centers and those resources. So this is where we need to meet them. So this is a timeline of our social media campaigns, and we're going to talk through all of them. And through each slide, I have like a little kind of ticker with a box around where we are in the process so you can see. And I just wanted to give you this overview. So over the last 10 months, we've consumer tested, promoted, and analyzed 2 full social media campaigns for youth and young adults. And then one sort of smaller companion campaign that I kind of call campaign 2B. And that actually just wrapped up. So that ran through January 2021. So starting at the beginning there in April, we began to develop and test our first campaign, which ran on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook over the course of 7 weeks. And this was really a direct response to the quickly changing world for youth and young adults as a result of COVID-19. And I won't get into specific details of each campaign. So again, this is just an overview. And then we saw that this landscape kind of started to change in the fall. We were getting more information about how tobacco use patterns were changing for youth and young adults. And so we actually shifted our focus and created a digital treatment campaign for youth and young adults. And that was developed and consumer tested in October. And then that was promoted solely on Instagram in November and December. And then again, that little 2B campaign, little companion campaign, ran in January and was promoted just on Instagram. And that campaign I do want to call out was not consumer tested, because it really all related to just encouraging quit attempts. So there were no new messages. It was related to New Year's resolutions, and they were all previous messages and images that we had tested. So again, we didn't really reinvent the wheel there, so we didn't retest it. So we're going to start by talking about how to develop your campaign messages. So this is really probably the question I get most often when I talk about social media is, how do I start this process? And the first thing I always suggest is really having a clear goal. And that sounds really vague and maybe even obvious, but a good campaign has to have a clear goal. And the goal will shape the entirety of your campaign's subsequent steps. So, start by asking, what is the goal? And what do we want to accomplish by placing this social media? Do you want to focus on prevention, preventing tobacco initiation, encouraging quit attempts, supporting quit attempts, because each one of those aims is going to have a very different tone and likely a different audience. And so, again, who is your audience and who are you speaking to? And this may seem obvious. Yes, we're working with youth, and yes, we're working with young adults or college students. But are we messaging, to experimenters? Are we messaging to freshman students? Are we messaging to current tobacco users? And really, the more you can have this clear vision of who you're crafting these messages for, the better campaign reach you're going to have. And then assess the landscape, right? So, let's say you're wanting to support quit attempts. Ask, what's the landscape of use patterns? How has the tobacco culture or use or products changed since any previous messaging we've done? Thinking just about COVID-19 specifically, what is driving tobacco use? How is this impacting things like stress and boredom? And again, knowing that landscape will continue to really hone in on the right message at the right time, and it's going to be delivered to the right folks. The next thing I would suggest is really ask questions. So youth and young adults are the experts. And we start every campaign that we have with a brainstorm with our youth board of directors and also with our college board members. And we ask them, what products are you seeing? What are you hearing on campus? Are you seeing more tobacco? Are you seeing any messages on social media? Are you noticing anything around you? And then as you've started to craft this message by going through this list of goal, audience, and landscape, collaborate with the youth partners and the student partners that you have around you. Ask them to review and read, and even create messages and be part of that process. Because, so many times I've created what I think is a really poignant message or post, and then I get feedback that's like, this sounds like an old person said this, or this doesn't make sense, or say it this way instead. And so it's incredibly helpful to remember that we are not talking to or for youth and young adult partners with this messaging, but that we are encouraging and including them in it, because we often have a different tone, especially when we work in the field. So jumping into our spring 2020 campaign, and I have to say, I put this image on there, and every time I look at it, it makes me so sad, because it really is just like, oh. So with our 2020 campaign, we really, had to think about what's happening at this point, right? And it's COVID-19. So we're seeing youth and young adults really trying to adapt to immense changes in their day-to-day life. We're going to things like virtual learning, we're sheltering in place, and we're hearing pretty intense impacts on mental health and stress, and all of these being related to a change in tobacco use. And so with that in mind, we worked, like I said, with our youth board and also our college COF student board to develop a social media campaign that was truly relevant and engaging and would speak to those really new and unique challenges, because we had never faced anything like this before, and we didn't have existing messaging to leverage. And what we heard from, young people, and what was really coming across strongly was that the message mattered. There was so much, and I think this is like March, April, we're all kind of beginning of this. There was so much health messaging happening at that time, right? And young people were feeling flooded with information on tobacco and COVID and all of these unknowns. And, they expressed feeling overwhelmed or scared. And none of this messaging actually addressed the issues related to tobacco that they were feeling and experiencing. And those feelings and experiences really fell into three main themes or buckets for us. So young people were asking, how do I cope with the stress and anxiety I'm feeling right now without tobacco? And how do I address the feelings of loneliness as a result of sheltering in place, right? This is unprecedented. These are all new points for all of us. And then finally, managing boredom, right? So how do I manage all of this time at home, all of this free time? I can't see my friends. I can't go do anything in groups. How do I manage this boredom without tobacco? And what came across really strongly was that there was a sense of urgency kind of at this juncture in the spring. It was really an idea of what's going to help me cope right now in this moment. What can I do to not use tobacco? And so we developed, again, using our college partners, messages that spoke directly to those three feelings expressed. And we focused one on motivating quit attempts and then also supporting quit attempts. So moving into how we tested those messages. So up here we've got our kind of screenshots of what our SurveyMonkey survey looked like. And we took those messages that we drafted and we transposed them on stock images and promoted this on SurveyMonkey, again, leveraging our youth board and college board to share the link. And we collected over 60 responses from youth and young adults throughout California. I believe we had 11 counties represented. And just for you data lovers, I made a little Post-it note here that we had a median age of youth reviewers at 15 and a median age of young adult reviewers at 22. So again, really our target demographic age. And we showed each post with a number, and we asked a series of very simple questions. Which is your favorite? Which is your least favorite? What do you like? What do you dislike? What would you change? And we asked specifically because, right, this is a time of information dump. Would you look at this campaign as you're scrolling through social media? Would this get your attention? Where would you place this? What social media do young people interface with? Preferences about hashtags, because again, we don't want to assume we know social media, and it changes quickly. It's a landscape that changes quickly. And then finally, and most importantly, are there any other messages that you would like to see included that you think are relevant now? And so while this campaign feedback that we collected was overwhelmingly positive, there was some pretty critical feedback offered. And this is where humility comes into campaign development. And it really, we wouldn't have gotten this feedback if we didn't consumer test. So my one point is, even if you have 10 young people to ask, or a handful, or a niece or a nephew who can share it, always ask, because the feedback we got in this campaign really shaped not only this campaign, but also future campaigns, and really provided some of our greatest lessons learned, because this was also our first foray into really using social media to relay health messaging and cessation in a full-scale campaign. Excuse me. So here are some very clear examples of the youth and young adult feedback that helped shape this campaign. So the top row there are the images that we actually tested and showed to reviewers. And then the bottom there are the final versions. And so those are post youth and young adult feedback being incorporated, and they look very different. So just starting there on the left, we'll start with the first one there. So young people looked at this and were like, this looks like stock image. Quarantine is something my mom would say. And, I wouldn't look at this. This isn't, the message might be right, but if I'm not going to look at the picture, if the quarantine exclamation mark doesn't speak to me, I'm not going to look at it. So they suggested, I want to see a real person that looks like me. I want to see a young person, and I just want to feel good when I look at it. And so incorporating that feedback, we selected a different image. We got rid of the mom speak quarantine, and the outcome was totally different. That middle post there, I think, is probably our greatest lesson learned, and really the most interesting. It was the most polarizing with our youth and young adult reviewers in terms of feedback. So several people felt that that top image was kind of too much doom and gloom. It maybe felt a little negative, a little cheesy. But conversely, a handful of people did like it. They said it felt real. It felt like, yeah, that's how I feel. I feel trapped inside of my house. I can't see my friends. I'm feeling all of those things. And so we actually had a suggestion from a reviewer that said, why don't you do a second version that has kind of a more positive swing and a positive tone to kind of cast that net wider for the different types of messaging young people might want to see. And so it's such a powerful juxtaposition just to see how tweaking that language from, a focus on the positive outcome of quitting and pairing that with an upbeat, I mean, that's like such a joyful image of a young person, and just swapping the language of increasing stress and anxiety to decreasing when you quit. It's a totally different experience when you interface with it. And again, this is not something that we would have ever, a place we would have gotten to without that youth and young adult feedback. And then that final version there on the right, this was the least liked image. And there were some harsh words there that, it looks cheesy. It looks like an old white woman. The, make ohms, not O's didn't translate. It just felt kind of stagnant and generic to see just a random leg. And again, we got the feedback that, young people wanted to see color. They wanted to see an actual face. And again, you can see a very different draft product versus the final product. And then on the right, there are just a couple of additional takeaways. So we actually started out with a campaign name called Try Something New. And it turns out the word try really elicits experimentation with drugs for young people. And so one person even said like, oh, I really like the idea of try something new when you talk about vaping, because I want to try these new vitamin vapes that don't have nicotine in them. And so we were like, okay, we need to go back to the to the sounding board here. And so we ended up with Find Something New. I think I showed you on the SurveyMonkey asked about our hashtags. And so we started out with hashtag quit tobacco. And again, we heard tobacco isn't relevant. My friends aren't going to click on something that says quit tobacco. Really, you need to say vaping for any, youth and young adults to look at it. So we switched that hashtag. And then just based on the feedback of really wanting to see inclusive imagery, inclusive imagery and diverse images, we actually grew our campaign from 9 posts to 18. So again, this is all a result of that youth and young adult feedback. And so here's our final project in all of its 18 post glory. And again, you can just really feel the color, the diversity, the simple direct messaging. And you can kind of see on the left there, we start out with quit motivators, and then we go into tips. And that was strategic as well. And we'll talk about sort of how to deploy a campaign in our lessons learned section. And all of these posts directed young people to our cessation website, which was released in conjunction with this campaign. And this became a really critical piece or a critical learning for us, which is that all posts need to be tied to a call to action or have a link to a resource when interfacing with youth and young adults. This was, again, something we'll talk about more in our kind of overarching lessons learned. But just as a side note, we do have this site available for you, and this is in both English and Spanish, and has downloadable materials you can share on social media. And so moving into placing our campaign. So we've tested it, we've refined it, we've finalized it. And so you can see we've got our placement calendar there. We placed the post on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And each post ran for roughly a week over the course of 7 weeks. We posted the digital media on varying days at various hours to get a sense of when most people were viewing these. And we did, I do want to call out because it's important, we did promote these. So we did paid promotions on all three platforms to increase our impressions and our reach. What's nice about doing a paid promotion, if you are able to, is that you can target it. So we targeted all of these posts to young adults living in California, age 13 to 25. And again, our budget wasn't huge, but it was impactful. And again, we were able to do, most of our design in-house. So really our expense with this campaign was the promotion piece. And there are really great analytics across all three sites when you do promote to see user interfacing. And so again, here is sort of like how we did, right? So here is our reach and takeaways. And you can kind of see there, it's a lot of numbers, but the takeaway here is that Instagram was overwhelmingly more successful across all three metrics of total impressions. So that's how many people see your post, your likes, and also, and probably most importantly, to be quite honest, is the click through to that CYA Cessation website, which again, we provided in all of our posts. And so what was, I think, interesting and also worthy of calling out here is that particularly with Instagram and a little bit so on Facebook, we saw a huge amount of likes on the front end of our campaign and not so many clicks on the quit on the quit resource in the beginning. But as that campaign went on, we actually saw this shift and our likes started to decrease, but the click-throughs increased. And so I think there's something definitely to be said about doing a multi-week campaign and a theory of change. So, I view that sort of as maybe folks were kind of bookmarking the page or liking it in the beginning. And then as they kind of moved into considering quitting to more of an active quit attempt, they were maybe going back and accessing that resource. So again, always tie your social media to a quit resource, even if it's not clicked on in that moment. It might be saved, it might be bookmarked, it might be shared. And again, you can see in the trend that was what happened for us. And then just some key takeaways from this campaign specifically, again, we'll dive into these lessons learned later. But really, again, when you are interfacing or sharing any health messaging or cessation on social media with youth and young adults, it needs to be bright, it needs to be vivid, it needs to have color. Over and over again, we heard it has to look pretty for me to stop. There's so, young people show us all the time, we just scroll. So again, bright, vivid color is largely preferred. Faces, and this was an interesting one for me because I think sometimes there can be this idea of a lot of awkward stock imagery with people smiling and doing this, but young people like faces and they want to see happy faces and real faces. And that was something that came up a lot, was that we received a lot of positive feedback on this campaign because these look like real young people. It was diverse, it was inclusive, it reflected the diversity of our state and our communities. And young people like that, it felt real. Again, there's also a strong preference for the positive health messaging. So again, thinking about those two images where it was saying, vaping will increase versus your risk of decreases when you quit vaping, or you'll feel, less anxiety. So again, that positive spin versus a scare tactic was overwhelmingly preferred. And again, actionable tips, not just a health or a health fact or a snippet, but actually something that a young person can do, whether that's journaling, whether that's meditating, whether that's, chewing on a piece of gum, something they can actually do. Something we heard over and over again, and this was a learning that we moved into with our next campaign, was that it's one thing to put a resource, but young people will not interface with a resource unless they know it's both free and anonymous. So having that stated with any resource, click here for free and anonymous, XYZ, putting that in the front end is going to include and increase youth leveraging that. And then Instagram. So we learned that Instagram was overwhelmingly popular. And actually all of our targeting from this point forward and all of our paid promotions were exclusively on Instagram. So cut to October, and we're coming into the fall, and we've run our first campaign, and things are starting to look very different with youth patterns and health messaging and cessation needs in the field for youth and young adults. And by the fall, we just had more data. And so we had a much better idea of how tobacco use was changing for youth and young adults as a result of the pandemic. And what we were actually seeing is that fewer young people were who were experimenters were transitioning into long-term use, which is good news. But unfortunately, the young people who were frequent or regular tobacco users were now becoming more addicted, and as a result had escalated product use. And so, this was very clearly a critical time for cessation messaging. And so we decided to develop a digital tobacco treatment campaign for youth and young adults. And again, as our starting place, right? So this is how we're crafting the message, right? We're assessing the landscape, we're putting our ears to the ground, we're talking to our youth partners, and overwhelmingly the message was, we need some sort of treatment or cessation campaign. And so again, as we are shifting towards this tobacco treatment model for our next campaign, we really wanted to know the types of cessation messages that mattered the most to young people right now. So again, that sense of urgency we discussed with the first campaign, and their top motivators to quit. And those are identified by youth and young adults as being the fear of health outcomes, specifically tied to COVID-19, but overall as well, which was sort of a new trend we were hearing. The expense of addiction, so the cost, and then, or excuse me, the expensive, well, I guess also the expensive addiction, but the products themselves. And then also the stigma of addiction, right? So this fear of, I don't want to be addicted. I don't want to lose my control to something. And so then, and maybe even more importantly, the young people stressed that they really wanted real tips and actionable things they could use to help manage cravings and triggers. And there was also this fear of withdrawal symptoms. So we really wanted to focus this campaign as something that could be used well at home, right? So things they could easily and readily grab around the house to manage triggers. Exercises they can do at no cost, things like, journaling, meditating, grabbing a toothpick, making flavored water. And we knew it had to feel accessible, and we also needed to really speak to the quit motivator. And so we took those resources and the idea of health, the cost of vaping and the fear of addiction, and we developed, again, very similar to our first round, 12 social media posts. And we this was more of a two-pronged campaign, whereas the first one kind of had a flow to it. This one had a very clear delineation. So our first 12 messages were all really spoke to the quit motivators and sought to encourage and motivate quit attempts. And then the remaining 12 messages were all about actionable tools to manage tobacco triggers and cravings. Just like that first round of consumer testing, we, plopped all these images in SurveyMonkey. SurveyMonkey is your friend for consumer testing, by the way. And again, we asked folks which posts they liked, what they didn't like, if they would, interface with this campaign. We asked what they learned, and if there were any additional messages needed. Again, we had nearly 100 youth and young adults review this campaign. We had a greater reach with this. We had folks, I believe, in 15 different counties throughout the state, and a pretty similar median age. We were at 16 for youth reviewers and a median age of 20 for our young adult reviewers. And then again, here is, again, how our sort of draft, so the top line is what our reviewers saw. The bottom line is the final product. And again, very simple changes and tweaks, but the whole tone and delivery of the message is different. So just starting there on the left, the message didn't change, just the intro did. And one of the reviewers said, honestly, the second I see something that starts with your risk of, insert instantly seems boring and serious, I'm not going to read it. I'm not going to look at it. And so simply changing that wording, same image, same message, was so impactful. Again, with that second image there, I think this is a really good call out that we need to be mindful of the language we might be using. So a lot of young people said, I don't know what a quit team is. What does that mean? It's something that we use frequently because we are in tobacco control, but we can't assume that that language translates. So again, same image, same message, just a different language and way of relaying it. So I think back to why imagery is so important as well. So the message didn't change here. This was just the picture. And several young people said that the woman on top just looked unhappy. You know, her vibe didn't really match the message. And they actually, probably 15 to 20% of our reviewers said they wanted to see a smiling face. They wanted to see positivity, and it felt like there was a lot of doom and gloom, and that considering quitting or thinking about quitting tobacco needed to feel positive. It didn't need to feel scary. And so I think it's just such a different tone when you compare those two. And it was just swapping out an image. And then that last image there on the right, the feedback here was just that this felt too wordy, which I agree now seeing these side by side. And we actually parsed that out and made 4 different messages from that for kind of each activity. But I think the most important thing that I learned from this was that the word craving wasn't something that a lot of youth or young adults knew what that meant. I'm craving tobacco. What does that mean? And someone actually said, does craving mean you have the urge? And I said, okay, so that's the word we need to use. That's the word that translates. So here is our final project. Again, this was a 2-prong approach. We front-ended the campaign with the Quit Motivator post, and you can see those there on the left. And then our second wave of posts really served to support the subsequent quit attempts. And I do want to mention that this campaign was also reviewed by the California Smokers Helpline, a local cessation expert, and also a physician prior to launch. And then all of the posts linked folks to our cessation website, but it was also done in conjunction with a new tool, which is our digital quit kit. And again, we really made sure that this included tips and tools that were either low cost or could be found around the house. And again, this was free and available for download on our website for young people. And so this campaign, as I mentioned, we, decided that Facebook and Twitter were not resulting in the reach we wanted to see with young people. So this was placed on Instagram only. Like the last campaign, this ran for 7 weeks. Again, we did pay to promote these with targeting, excuse me. And like the previous campaign, this was targeted at youth and young adults living in California, age 13 to 25. And again, as I just chatted about, we did these in 2 waves. And so some pretty interesting results. So that top line there has our spring campaign results with Instagram, and the bottom has our fall. And again, this is pretty much or nearly the same budget with the same targeting. And what this shows us is that we really did have the right message at the right time on the right platform. And so this is nearly, 110% increase of click-throughs to the cessation resource since the previous campaign. So again, this idea of really creating the campaign with this theory of change, right? So we're starting with messages to encourage and promote quit attempts, and then coming in with tips to support an active quit. And again, we saw that, like the previous campaign, we had more likes in the beginning, and then we had several more click-throughs at the end. And then this is that little kind of companion campaign, as I was calling it, the 2B. And this really was a culmination of all of our learnings on messages and imagery for youth and young adult audiences. Again, we did not consumer test this because it wasn't any new messages. It was really just focused on now's a great time to quit. And it was really tied to supporting the momentum of the end of the year and lots of New Year's resolutions likely to quit tobacco. And this just wrapped up, so we haven't fully analyzed this, but this did run through January. And just looking at some of the preliminary data was incredibly successful. So jumping into our findings and lessons learned. So I think this really kind of captures it. So the post there on the left was our first round in spring 2020. It had 6 clicks to our quit site. It's still 6 people who reached out for a resource, but when we compare it to what we did in 2021, we had 107 clicks through to our cessation site. And again, just thinking about what we've learned from the feedback and comparing these 2 images. Young people want to see a real face, they want to see diversity, they want positive messaging, they want to see someone that looks like them. They want to, have the resource say that it's free and anonymous. And so I think, again, this is just a really helpful juxtaposition and really captures what we've learned through this process. And then so kind of just going through each bucket here with regards to messaging for youth and young adults on social media. Again, you want to be simple, you want to be direct, you want it to be easy to digest. I always will run sort of a reading level test. And as a rule of thumb, you're always going to want to keep that at or around the 8th grade reading level. And just be mindful about public health speak and tobacco speak. So remembering things like triggers, or cravings, or a quit team, or a quarantine, these things may not translate with youth and young adult audiences. Again and again, we know that scare tactics or just overly negative tobacco messaging isn't, at least now with what's going on with all the health messaging and sort of the fear around COVID, isn't really the tone that young people and young adults are looking for or are interfacing with. And what they are hoping to see is just more hopeful, more positive, more upbeat. That was something that came up a lot. I want something more upbeat, are the types of messages they're hoping to see. Again, they're wanting messages that are tied to an action they can take, not just a fact. So things like gum and toothpicks and using a journal or going through a walk, they want something actionable. Again, like we talked about, we always want social media or any post that we do to tie to a resource. Again, that click through and that engagement is really important. And again, if we are tying to that resource, we always want to clearly say it's free and anonymous. And then in terms of design and image preferences, again, young people want bright and vibrant colors. As you're scrolling through the flood, you want something that's going to catch your attention. Faces came up so many times in feedback, and particularly happy faces. Smiles were mentioned a lot. They wanted to see and feel joy. And faces and real people were preferred over any type of stagnant object or a vector image, so like an animated graphic. And then be mindful, stock image, I think, and iStock and all of these photo services are working to get more inclusive, but a lot of it looks like cheesy, non-diverse, non-inclusive imagery. So if you are using stock image, be mindful of what you're picking and what you're selecting and making sure that it looks like a real person and has the tone of authenticity. Cheesy came up a lot. And then in terms of how youth and young adult populations are interfacing with social media, we do know that Instagram in particular is a better platform and a more preferred platform for these types of messages over Twitter and Facebook. We are looking into maybe Snapchat and TikTok. We know they're popular with youth and young adults, but they're maybe not the best platforms for health messaging or digital media. They're really more suited for video content, which if you have the ability to do, I think could pair really well. Young people like hashtags, so get really comfortable with them and get creative with them. And then just a preference in terms of hashtagging, and this was something we asked in our SurveyMonkey, was that they like to see the first letter of words capitalized. So I gave an example of there. So you'd want to do the F, the L, and the C for first letter capitalized. Get down with your emojis. Emojis are very popular, and also interactive posts, right? So clicking, scrolling, anything that's engaging. One thing to call out is that youth and young adults are not going to copy and paste a link. So if you are clicking through to a resource, you need to put it in your either your website bio or in the top of your page for them to click on, because they're not going to, the link to bio, they're not going to click through and copy and paste if it's not there. And then just briefly, I know we're getting close to time here. I wanted to share the social media resources that we have available to you for free on our website. So again, these are all of our posts. You are welcome to use them, download them. If you would like them customized for the call to action or the resource to be, your student health center or something other than our cessation website, that's something that we're happy to do. And again, these have tips for posting and specific hashtags you can use, but again, be creative. Also mentioned was the digital quit kit. This is available on that same website. We are currently working to translate this into Spanish, but right now it is available for download in English as a PDF. So we've got, 2 minutes for questions here. And again, this presentation will be shared with everyone, and I believe also has been recorded. But is there any questions, any comments? Anything that you're dying to know about using social media for health messaging?
I have a question. Hi, I'm Kiva Clift. I work at UC Davis. And we have tried to do some cessation messaging. We partnered, we got some grant funds to work with what's called the X program, which is a digital tobacco cessation tool that was developed by the Truth Initiative and the Mayo Clinic. And we've struggled with some of our boosted posts getting rejected because of the language used in the captions, in terms like we can't even use the word quit. We didn't use quit, and we used nicotine replacement therapy the other day, and that also got rejected. So I'm wondering if you have any tips for workarounds for that.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm glad that you bring that up. So we have had, I would say, probably 60% of our Instagram posts pushed back and being flagged. And so we have had to go through the process of requesting a review. And typically it's, I think it's auto-generated that if there are these keywords like tobacco or nicotine or quit, they'll just instantly reject it. And so every time I just have kind of like a canned response that says who we are and what we're doing, and that we're not promoting or selling tobacco or nicotine for youth and young adults. And that usually does it. I've had pushback one additional time or layer on top of that, but they do all get approved. Is that sort of the same process you're having as well?
I've found it's, as you said, it's rejected by a robot, and it's not easy to get a hold of a real human. So we've just tried to edit posts, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it, as I said, we've had to just scrap it and do something different.
When you get that rejection, I don't know if you've noticed or have done this, but there is a link that says something like, reevaluate my post, or I don't know the exact language, but sometimes you can just click on that and that flags it, and you don't even have to put a message. And then I think it goes to like the next level robot and then, or maybe even a person. So maybe try that route before adjusting language. And then, like I said, just have kind of a canned response to send, and it escalates through once you click that, please re-review. But it can be time intensive.
Sure. Great. Thanks.
Yeah, sure thing. Any other questions, or maybe even successes you've had? It's, I think resource sharing is so important, and we all have different lessons learned or tips. All right, well, you are now all experts in social media and health messaging for youth and young adults. go bravely into the virtual world. Well, thank you all so much. These slides and the presentation will be made available. And as always, I'm here as a resource. If you have questions or would like some direction or assistance, we're always here. And I believe now we're all going back for a closing session. Is that correct, Christina?
Yes, so if you all have your agendas out, you're going to join the same session that we were in the beginning. It should be under closing session on the agenda. We'll see you all in a little bit. And thank you, Caitlin, for an amazing presentation.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.